Well, setting aside the threat of a snap election for a moment, what about the content of the budget itself? The Parliamentary Budget Officer issued a new report today warning the government is overstating what effect its stimulus measures will have on the economy. And he also warns the massive spending may limit the federal government's fiscal options down the road. Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux is with me now. Mr. Giroux, good to see you again. Thanks for being here. Look, let's begin with the economic outlook. As projected in the budget, how does your forecast for what's ahead for the Canadian economy and economic growth over the next 5 years, how does that compare with the government's expectations and predictions in the budget?
Well, our projections are closely aligned to those that the government released in its budget. So there's very little difference between the two projections. For example, for nominal GDP, which is the broadest measure of the size of the economy, there's a $5 billion difference, or 0.2%, in the level of nominal GDP, which is literally nothing for over $2,500 billion economy, so $2.5 trillion economy. It's virtually nothing. Where there is a difference is when it comes to the fiscal forecast, so the forecast for the deficit. There's a difference between our forecasts and those of the government. So after taking into consideration budget measures, we arrive at deficits that are $5.6 billion higher than what the government has released in the budget last month.
And what accounts for those higher projections from your end?
Well, it's in part differences in costs when it comes to the cost of the COVID-19 support measures, and also differences in forecasted revenues from tax revenues. So these are the main sources of the difference, as well as difference in the revenues generated by enterprise crown corporations.
Okay, let's talk about the measures in the budget. The government says the budget includes more than $100 billion to stimulate the economy over the next 3 years. How much of that, in your analysis, is actually stimulus spending?
Well, we've taken a look at that, obviously, because of the government claim that it's spending over $100 billion in stimulus. And what we find is that a couple of these billions of dollars is in fact amounts that are for COVID-related support. So the government itself has made it quite a stark distinction in the fall economic statement last fall, as well as throughout last year, that COVID-19 support measures were exactly that, support measures to ensure that the economy did not collapse as the pandemic made its way into the Canadian economy. So there's support measures on the one side that are intended to help us get through the pandemic. And then the government in the fall statement said that it would invest an additional $70 to $100 billion in stimulus to jumpstart the economy. So we've taken out all of the measures that were COVID-19 support measures, and we've limited ourselves to a 3-year window, which the government said it would target in the fall statement to spend that money and invest that money to jumpstart the economy. So taking out COVID-19 measures, we arrive at $69 billion that could be considered stimulus measures over the 3-year horizon, this year and the next 2 years.
Okay, the finance minister says that stimulus in the budget will boost economic growth by 2% a year and create 334,000 jobs. Your analysis brings you to a different conclusion. What is it?
Well, we conclude that the stimulus measures will increase GDP by 1% and will create a more humble 74 to 90,000 jobs over that 3-year horizon.
So less than a third of what the government predicted in the budget.
Exactly, because a good part of the stimulus that the government considers stimulus was announced before the budget last fall, in fact. Some of it is clearly not stimulus, as I just mentioned. And so these measures would all have been taken into account before the budget by private sector economists on whom the government relies to get its economic projections. So you announced something way before the budget in the fall of 2020. Private sector economists take that into account when they tabled their forecasts for the years ahead. So you cannot count that in the economic projections and also say that this will create additional economic stimulus. That would be double counting for some of the measures.
Yeah. The budget also sets labor sort of market indicators, the employment rate, hours worked, the level of employment, to decide when stimulus would be wound down, those guardrails the government always talks about. But you find that almost all of the jobs lost during the pandemic, they'll actually be made up by March of next year when the stimulus measures are supposed to kick in. So what does that say about the government's approach?
Well, the government had indicated in its fall statement that it would use guardrails to guide itself as to when the the stimulus measures should be wound down. But by looking at the numbers and even in the budget, these guardrails or these labor market indicators will almost all of them be back to pre-pandemic levels by the end of this fiscal year, so by March 2022, which will be the first year of the stimulus measures. So that suggests, as I've been saying before, that the economic stimulus might be too much and might be too late. So 1 year of economic stimulus might be sufficient to return to pre-pandemic levels of employment or labor market indicators if the goal is solely to return to pre-pandemic labor market indicators. If the goal is to implement new policies, that's totally different. But if you're looking at stimulus for the labor market, 1 year should be sufficient.
All right. Yves Giroux, Parliament's budget officer. Good to talk to you again, sir. Thanks for taking time to speak with me.
My pleasure.